What if I told you that the Bible you thought you knew is standing like a sealed door, and behind it waits a story in which black people are not on the edges, but at the burning center of God's plan for the end times? What if the prophecies you heard since childhood carry another layer, a hidden thread of identity and justice and judgment, ready to shake nations that believed they were safe? Imagine reading the same verses, the same old pages, yet suddenly seeing faces you never thought were their faces the world tried to erase. There's a question rising across continents and across late-night prayers. Is it possible that God's chosen people include a scattered people in dark skin, and that Iran, ancient Persia, holds a key that will unlock the final chapter of their story? Tonight, the path opens into one of the most disputed territories in all of biblical prophecy: the Black Israelite identity and the prophetic role of Iran in the last days. This is not a quiet classroom debate, not a cold chart on a wall. It is the sound of chains under the deck of a ship, the roar of crowds in modern cities, the low hum of centrifuges deep under Iranian soil, all echoing against the same ancient words. Some churches have grown comfortable with one version of the story. A map that keeps Israel in one small strip of land and keeps black bodies somewhere in the background of history. But there is a growing company of believers, black and white, Hispanic and Asian sons and daughters from many nations, who have begun to ask hard questions about who Israel really is. They turn to Deuteronomy chapter 28 and hear the warning that God's people would go back to a house of bondage, in ships sold as slaves, scattered among nations, and left without a human redeemer. They look at Isaiah chapter 11, where the Lord reaches out a second time to recover his remnant, not only from Assyria and Egypt, but from Cush, from Elam, from the islands of the sea, a map that stretches into Africa and across the oceans. And they whisper, could this be larger than the borders on the evening news? Yeah, the mystery does not stop with scattered tribes, for in the shadows of prophecy, Persia keeps returning. Ezekiel chapter 38 places Persia inside a vast coalition that will storm against Israel in the latter days. Jeremiah chapter 49 speaks of Elam, the old kingdom in the land, now called Iran, facing the breaking of its bow, the shattering of its strength. And in the days in which you are breathing, Iran threatens to wipe Israel off the map tests. Its missiles forges alliances that look eerily similar to the lists of ancient seers. The air between Tehran and Jerusalem trembles with words that sound like rehearsals of an old script. At this point, your heart may feel the edge of fear and division. Perhaps it sounds like a teaching meant to separate black from white, nation from nation Israel from the rest of the world. But the deeper current of Scripture tells another truth. All nations stand under one God, every tongue and tribe, and people are woven into his design. The real question is not whose flag will fly higher, but whether you are ready to face what his design truly looks like when secrets come into the light in this journey. We will move like pilgrims through layered halls of revelation, ancient texts, Hebrew manuscripts, the Midrash, and the prophet's archaeological traces in forgotten cities and scattered stone and studies that whisper of unexpected kinship between Africa and the Middle East, modern headlines from Tel Aviv and Tehran. All these will be brought side by side until a pattern begins to emerge. You are being invited into an uncomfortable grace, a vision that may overturn long-held assumptions about race, about Israel, about the end of the age. This is not only about Black Israelites and not only about Iran. It is about the culmination of human history, the gathering of all tribes before the throne and your place within that gathering. The story rises from deserts and slave ships, from palaces and prison cells. Yet it presses into this single moment in which you listen. The pages have been waiting. The question is, can you bear what they are about to say? The trail opens into the second chamber of the story, where the weight of ancient warnings begins to press against the present world like stone upon stone. Here the rhythm slows, the air thickens, and the words of Deuteronomy rise not as a distant sermon, but as the echo of a people who walked through fire and found themselves forgotten by the kingdoms of men. When the text speaks of a return to bondage by ships, it does not whisper, it thunders across centuries. carrying the sound of water closing around wooden hulls, and the voices of captives packed beneath decks. Their names were taken, their tongues stripped, their histories scattered in the wind. And yet the prophecy stands as though it had watched every mile of the middle passage in this light. The verse becomes more than ink, it becomes a mirror held up to the trauma of generations, for the warnings of Deuteronomy were not written as abstractions, but as the shadow cast by covenant break. A shadow that follows a people wherever they go until the day the Lord gathers them again. And so the question rises like a slow flame: if the ancient Israelites faced captivity by land in the days of Assyria and Babylon, then who are the people who endured captivity by sea in the age of empires? The world tries to answer with its own narratives, but Scripture remains like a locked gate, waiting for those who dare to examine the pattern it presents. In the passages of Isaiah, the voice of prophecy stretches far beyond borders drawn by modern hands. It speaks of Cush, the lands of deep rivers and dark soil south of Egypt. It speaks of the islands of the sea places where the children of Africa were carried and dispersed. It speaks of Elam, the soul of ancient Iran, all woven together in a single act of divine recovery, as though the Lord were reaching into multiple continents to gather a single scattered body. And here a strange thread emerges, for the remnant mentioned by Isaiah is not a remnant of random nations, but the remnant of his people, a phrase that pierces the silence with unsettling clarity. The prophet seemed to see a world in which the true sons and daughters of Israel were no longer standing in the land of their ancestors, but were scattered in lands that would never recognize them. Yet this scattering never meant abandonment, it meant preparation. A long season in which identity would sleep like seeds buried in deep earth, until the appointed time now in the present age. Those seeds are stirring in small apartments and crowded churches and midnight living rooms. People of African descent open old scriptures and find that the verses seem to speak in their direction. Their questions are neither prideful nor hostile. They are the questions of a people awakening from amnesia, feeling the tremor of recognition in their bones. But this awakening does not belong to one people alone. It has begun to touch many, black and white and brown, each sensing that the story of Israel is larger and more mysterious than any modern boundary can contain. Some begin to trace genealogies. Others study the customs preserved by their ancestors. Others listen to the dreams that visit them in the night, and through this searching, quiet realization spreads that God may gather from places the world has never considered. From continents the world has dismissed, from islands the world has forgotten. Yet as the voices rise from Africa and the diaspora, another sound rises from the east, from the mountains and deserts of Iran, a nation that moves through prophecy like a blade hidden in the cloak of time. And Ezekiel, the name Persia, stands beside nations that will one day rise in hostility against Israel, forming a coalition that moves like a storm across the land in Jeremiah. The name Elam is struck by judgment. Its bow shattered, its people scattered, its pride brought low. And while these words stand in ancient lines, the world of today seems to lean into them with alarming precision, for Iran tests its missiles, strengthens its alliances with Russia, speaks openly of erasing Israel from the earth, and the tension between prophecy and history grows thin, almost transparent, as if one were shining through the other. It is here that the story sharpens, because the same lands connected to the scattering of Israel, Cush, and the islands of the sea stand now beside the same land that prophecy marks for judgment, Elam, modern Iran. This crossing of paths is not coincidence. It is a sign that the ancient and the modern are not separate worlds, but layers of one unfolding drama. Some will resist this idea, calling it too controversial, too disruptive, too weighted with implications that unsettle national narratives and religious comfort. But truth has never adjusted itself to ease. It stands where it stands, and the heart must decide whether to look away or to look deeper. And so this second movement of the journey asks for courage, not the courage of battlefields, but the courage of truth-telling, a willingness to ask if history has been read through the lens of empire rather than the lens of Scripture. if prophecy has been interpreted according to political interest rather than divine intention. In this chamber of the story, your steps grow heavier because you begin to realize that these questions cannot be asked from a distance. They call you inward toward reflection, toward humility, toward the possibility that your understanding of Israel, of Africa, of the Middle East, of yourself may need to be unmade and remade. The ancient world is not dead. Its rivers still run beneath the soil of nations, and its prophecies still pulse beneath the skin of history. And now a gentle question must be set before you, a question not of intellect, but of presence, if this story reaches into your life, into your lineage, into your faith. What does it awaken in you, and what stirs in your heart as you walk this path with us? Tonight, do you feel fear, curiosity, resistance, or awakening your voice matters in this unfolding? So tell me, what do you see rising in your spirit as these truths begin to open before you? In the third chamber, the path narrows into a place where memory itself seems to breathe, and the fragments of forgotten histories rise like dust caught in a single beam of light here. The story turns toward the testimony carried not in scrolls alone, but in bones, bloodlines, customs, and ruins scattered across continents, for the earth often remembers what empires tried to erase. The question of identity does not depend on a single artifact or a single tribe. It moves like a slow river beneath centuries, gathering signs from many directions, and those signs begin to speak when placed beside the ancient warnings and promises of Scripture. In this quiet yet trembling space, we look toward the voices of science, anthropology, tradition, and oral memory, offering a shard of a larger mosaic, none complete by itself, yet each strangely aligned with the possibility that a portion of Israel may have wandered far deeper into Africa and the diaspora than the world has allowed itself to imagine. Consider the Lemba, a people of southern Africa whose customs linger like echoes from another land. They keep food laws that resemble the ancient instructions given to Israel. They guard oral traditions of an ancestor who carried sacred relics. They sing songs with patterns that seem older than the nations around them. When researchers studied their DNA, they found a marker often associated with the priestly line, a thread of identity that appears unexpectedly in a people long cut off from the centers of power. This does not force any conclusion, but it calls for reflection, as though a small light were shining. Through a crack in time in Ethiopia, the ancient community known as the Beta Israel kept traditions that resemble those of the early Israelites, observing laws and festivals with devotion preserved across centuries of isolation. Their roots may not trace perfectly to the tribes of old, yet their presence shows that the story of Israel in Africa is larger and more intricate than modern maps admit. In West Africa, there are tribes whose customs have stirred scholarly curiosity, their rites of purification, their mourning practices, their naming patterns, their ancient stories are coming from the East. Some of these resemble shadows of an older world, not clear enough to claim certainty, yet clear enough to awaken questions. In the Americas, the descendants of the transatlantic catastrophe carry fragmented memories, words in songs, rhythms in ceremonies, hints of customs practiced in secret by ancestors who remembered more than they were allowed to speak. Sometimes identity survives like embers beneath ashes, glowing faintly until a breath of time rekindles them. Archaeology contributes its own quiet testimony in ruins across Eastern Africa. Some structures mirror the style of ancient Middle Eastern builders in coastal trade routes. Pottery from Hebrew and Phoenician merchants appears in places where empires believed no connection should exist again. None. This stands as proof, but each piece feels like another stone placed near an ancient foundation, suggesting there may be a story whose outline has not yet been told in full. Then there is the strange thread of dreams and visions, for across the diaspora people speak of being awakened in the night with a sense of belonging to a story larger than their ancestry papers. Reveal. A man in Detroit reads Isaiah and feels something stir, as though the words were calling to him. From across desert winds, a woman in Lagos dreams repeatedly of a scroll she cannot read, yet feels she once knew. A student in London begins to study Hebrew and senses in herself an unexpected familiarity. These experiences are not evidence in the strict sense, yet they show that identity in Scripture is not always a matter of lineage alone. Sometimes it arrives through calling, through conviction, through spiritual resonance that touches the soul before it reaches the mind. The rise of interest in Hebrew customs among people of the diaspora may reflect a longing to reclaim dignity, but it may also reflect a deeper movement, a stirring of something ancient, as though the seeds planted long ago are breaking through the soil of time. Yet amid this awakening, caution is needed, for not every dream is revelation, not every claim is truth, and not every tradition is what it seems. Empires have scattered, merged and reshaped peoples across centuries, making history complex and sometimes contradictory, and so humility becomes the guiding light. A willingness to weigh evidence with sobriety, to recognize possibilities without forcing conclusions, and to allow Scripture to remain the root of understanding rather than personal desire. Still, the pattern is undeniable. Across continents, a thread runs from Africa to the Middle East and back again, a thread visible in customs, in genes, in stories, in ruins, in prayers whispered by those who were never told they had a place in the narrative. What this suggests is not a claim that all people of African descent belong to Israel, nor that Israel is limited to Africa. Rather, it suggests that the scattering of Israel may have reached farther than commonly believed, touching shores and jungles and valleys where no empire thought to look. It suggests that modern categories may be too small to contain the reach of ancient covenant, and while this quiet awakening unfolds, another current moves beneath the soil of Iran. For Persia, too, carries memories, ruins, inscriptions, and prophetic shadows, all intertwined with the fate of Israel. Some scholars note that ancient Persian rule once sheltered exiles and later oppressed them. Some suggest that the remnant of Israel, scattered into the east, may have passed through land that now echo with tension and conflict. These ideas remain debated, yet they highlight the complexity of the ancient world, where boundaries were fluid and identities often traveled farther than armies. As these fragments gather into a larger tapestry, the story begins to feel less like speculation and more like a mystery unfolding, a mystery that has not yet revealed its full shape, but has begun to rise from the deep light. The first outline of a forgotten coastline in this atmosphere of trembling possibility, the question turns inward once again, not to ancestry records alone, but to the inner chamber of the soul. For identity in Scripture is never merely a matter of genetics. It is covenant calling, purpose and destiny woven across generations by a God who scatters and gathers, who hides and reveals, who awakens and restores. And so as this third chamber closes, there is a question that lingers like a quiet wind over ancient stones in this mosaic of history and prophecy and awakening. Where do you sense your own story beginning to take shape? A low trembling rises through the corridors of prophecy, as though the ancient world itself were inhaling before it speaks, and the long-buried promises of God begin to stir beneath the dust of nations. From here, the fourth chamber opens, and the scrolls of ancient promise unfurl across continents. For the hand of the Lord moves in quiet corners, and on global fault lines alike the words of Isaiah begin to climb from the page into the realm of lived reality. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. And we see that hand reaching toward Cush, toward Elam, toward the islands of the sea, each phrase a compass pointing beyond one land or one people in the hush before dawn. The voice of the prophet becomes a lantern shining over Africa, over the scattered tribes of the diaspora, over men whose names were erased and women whose memory was suppressed. And it says, "Awake, arise, for you are part of the gathering in the distant east." It whispers across deserts to the lands once called Elam, the soil of modern Iran. And it says, your day comes and you must reckon with what you have done and what you will reveal, for the gathering of Israel in the end times is not a tidy return to a single plot of land, but a weaving of many threads, and this weaving touches Africa, the Americas, Asia, the Middle East, and yes, Persia. The prophecy of two sticks cannot remain sealed while one stick lies forgotten in sharecroppers' cabins or subterranean subway stations, or in the quiet confession on a park bench in Chicago. The stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph must become one in one hand, and the hand is not human, it is his. The journey of the return is neither swift nor visible. Only on maps it moves in tidal waves and in ripples in mass movements of people and in quiet awakenings of soul. There are fishers' and hunters' nets that catch many, and arrows that pierce hidden caves where the lost sit in shadows, the land of the north, the coastlands beyond memory, the places where Israel was driven, all begin to appear in the light of Scripture, and the diasporic children of Africa, the descendants of slaves, the children of islands across the sea, begin to sense the tug of remembrance, the Ethiopian desert, the Sudanese river, the Caribbean shore, the Brazilian plantation. The American cotton field all carry faint echoes of the covenant and faint rhythms of a lost pilgrimage. The gathering begins not simply with passports, but with recognition, not simply with relocation, but with identity awakened. And as that gathering unfolds, the world notices a shift-old assumption. Falter maps, redraw themselves, nations tremble, and the focus returns to Jerusalem, the mountain of the Lord's house, the ancient land of promise. Becomes a beacon, yet the gathering is global. The prophecy of Zechariah says, I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they pierced, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. This is both local and worldwide, for if the remnant is in Africa and the Americas and Asia, then the outpouring of the Spirit is not limited to one capital city, but resonates among tribes and tongues that never expected to be part of this story. The Spirit poured out makes the lowly as mighty as David, the hidden as visible as an angel, and the trembling as firm as the rock of ages. Meanwhile, the ground shakes beneath the feet of the proud, especially in lands like modern Persia, where prophecy names both judgment and restoration. The bow of Elam will be broken. The four winds will scatter the outcasts, declares the word of the Lord through Jeremiah. And when the nations see Uranus ball bending or breaking the stage is set for the next movement of the drama, the ancient Persian Empire, which once permitted Israel's restoration under Cyrus, now stands before the mirror of history and prophecy, forced to answer whether it will ally with the gathering or stand against it. Its missile silos hum, its alliances whisper of war, and its ideology presses like smoke into the room of nations. But the maker of nations holds the ledger. The gathering of Israel and the preparation of Persia happen under the same sovereign hand, and the collision is not chaos but part of the weaving. The people being gathered will face the nation, and the nations being judged will face the people, and the land of Israel will become a witness on the world stage. Yet through all this, the voice returns to you, the listener in your seat. The one reading this at midnight or passing through traffic. For you are not merely watching prophecy, you are living it. The gathering touches your lineage or your neighbor, your ancestry or your church family, your city or your street. The question presses, are you aware that the gathering is not happening somewhere else but in your midst? Are you prepared to recognize that the story of Israel and the story of Persia may have a chapter in your life? The scrolls open, the watchers stir. The trumpets draw nearer, but will you stand and say, yes, here I am. Send me in this fourth chamber. The path becomes steeper and the lantern brighter. And if you choose to follow, you must leave behind the small maps you held and hold fast to the broad terrain of covenant identity and destiny. The gathering is underway, and the question is not whether you will watch it, but whether you will step into it. A silent weight settles across the horizon of prophecy, not as a voice or a wind, but as a presence, as though an unseen hand were turning the page of history to reveal a chapter long overshadowed by brighter scenes. and from that turning emerges the ancient figure of Persia, rising from the dust with both mercy and menace in its wake. In this fifth chamber, the light dims into a bronze-colored twilight, as though history itself were pausing between memory and judgment. And the figure of ancient Persia rises from the horizon like a forgotten monument returning to view. Persia, the land that once held Israel's fate in its hands, turns again in prophecy, and its shadow stretches across the modern world in ways few expected, but the prophets foresaw. For to understand the end of the age, one must walk back through the gates of the Persian kings, through scroll-lined halls, where decrees could release captives or seal their doom. The first sound that reaches you is the echo of a name, Cyrus, a king, who stood outside the covenant, yet was called the anointed of the Lord. For in the days of ruin, when Jerusalem lay desolate, it was Persia that shattered Babylon and opened the path home. For the exiled Isaiah spoke of this long before Cyrus breathed his first breath, saying that a ruler from the east would shepherd Jacob and break the chains that no Hebrew hand could break. And so Persia once walked beside Israel as liberator, servant of divine purpose, unexpected vessel in a time when hope slept beneath ashes. Yet the palace halls of Persia also held another story, one woven through ambition, jealousy, and hidden hatred. It was there that Haman plotted the destruction of the Jews' plan, so complete that not a single child of the covenant would survive if it succeeded. And it was in that same palace that Esther rose in trembling courage. Facing the king with a plea that turned the direction of history, Persia was thus both a refuge and a threat, a guardian and an executioner, a land upon which Israel's fate swayed like a lamp. In the wind, a duality of Persia's role becomes a warning and a prophecy for nations that once defended God's people may one day turn against them, and nations that once threatened them may one day be judged for their violence. From that ancient throne room, the trail extends to modern Iran, a land whose mountains and deserts still remember the footsteps of prophets and kings, but whose rulers now speak with voices sharpened by rage and ideology. The scriptures name Persia in the procession of nations that will join a coalition rising against Israel in the latter days, a storm gathering. From the north and the east, a movement drawn not merely by politics, but by spiritual currents older than empires. Ezekiel saw Persia standing alongside power from the far region. Alliances forged in the cold fire of ambition. He saw nations joining the march, not in isolation but in conspiracy, bound by mutual contempt for Jerusalem, bound by a desire to overturn the order God himself established in Jeremiah's vision. The focus narrows to Elam, a kingdom nestled in the region now, ruled by Iran, and the prophecy becomes sharp as iron. The bow of Elam shall be broken, the foremost of their might. This is not the breaking of a wooden weapon. It is the breaking of a nation, a strength, the collapse of its pride, the unraveling of its power. And as the prophet speaks of scattering and judgment, the modern world watches Iran test missiles, enrich uranium, vow the erasure of Israel, and stand side by side with nations Scripture links to the final conflict. The ancient prophecy and the modern headline draw so close that they almost touch, as though separated by only a thin veil of time. Yet Persia's story holds more than judgment. For Jeremiah ends his oracle with a promise hidden inside the thunder. In the latter days I will restore the fortunes of Elam, saith the Lord. Here is a paradox. Iran judged, yet restored, broken, yet rebuilt, scattered, yet gathered. This suggests that Iran, though entangled in darkness, is not beyond mercy, that even nations who rise against the covenant can be brought low and later raised up by the very God they opposed. But before restoration comes reckoning, and before mercy comes fire. And so the modern world stands in the tension of this prophecy, watching Iran's nuclear ambitions, its alliances with Russia, its militant networks woven across borders, its threats echoing like war drums. And the question emerges, are we witnessing the prelude to the breaking of Elam's bow? The language of prophecy speaks not only through nations, but through patterns, through shifting alliances that mirror ancient coalitions, through leaders driven by visions of conquest, through ideologies that blend politics with a near religious hunger for destruction. Persia in the scriptures is more than a country, it is a force, a current, a spiritual engine that can build or destroy, depending on the hand that guides it. And so the fifth chamber forces us to face a deeper truth. The conflict between Israel and Iran is not merely geopolitical. It is a replay of an ancient struggle, the same tension that once filled the courts of Susa, the same hostility that nearly extinguished the covenant people, the same drama that turned upon the courage of Esther and the justice of God. But in these last days, the stage is larger, the stakes higher, the alliance is global. For the storm described by Ezekiel and the judgment described by Jeremiah form a dual prophecy in which Persia stands as both participant and target instrument and victim sword and shattered bow. Yet, amid all this, the figure of Persia in the days of Cyrus remains a reminder that God can use any nation for his purposes, even those outside the covenant, while the figure of Persia in the days of Haman remains a warning that hatred of God's people, when allowed to root itself in power, invites divine retribution. The path through this chamber presses upon your spirit with a difficult but necessary question: if nations are being positioned for their roles in the final act, then what role does your generation play as Persia rises and Israel awakens? For prophecy is not a tale to be observed from afar. It is the breathing skeleton of history, and every soul alive in these days is part of its unfolding. The story of Persia is not finished. The story of Israel is not finished. The story of diaspora awakening is not finished, and the story of your own calling stands among them like a door waiting to be opened. And so this fifth chamber ends with a truth as stern as stone. The nations move by the hand of the Lord, but individuals choose whether they move with him or against him. And the shadow of Persia stretches across the earth once more, asking whether you understand the times in which you live and whether your heart is ready for what the prophets saw rising from the dust of the ages. A deep hush falls over the unseen realm, not the hush of peace, but the hush before a storm, when every force of heaven and every shadow of darkness seems to hold its breath, and in that pause the true shape of the conflict begins to emerge, a conflict not born in parliaments or war rooms, but in the ancient rebellion that stirred long before nations drew their borders. In the sixth chamber, the veil lifts, and the world is seen not as a map of alliances, but as a battlefield of spirits, where Iran and Israel are not merely countries, but symbols moving under currents that run back to the dawn of creation, for long before missiles were armed or treaties were signed. There was a war in the heights, a clash that sent tremors through the fabric of existence, and that war still echoes. Through every earthly conflict we now witness, Scripture speaks of a dragon cast down, an ancient adversary who turns his fury toward the people through whom the promise will reign. He does not target them because of race or geography, but because through them the Redeemer entered the world, and through them the final restoration will come. And so the hostility between the nations is not simply political, it is the outward shape of an ancient hatred that seeks to disrupt the gathering of the tribes and delay the day when the king will return to reign. The woman pursued by the dragon is not a single modern nation. She is the covenant people scattered across continents, hidden in cities and islands, awakened in dreams and scriptures, oppressed in prisons and ghettos, yet preserved for a purpose that no empire has been able to erase. The remnants of Israel, including those awakened among the diaspora, feel the tremors of this spiritual conflict, often without understanding its origin. They face resistance, misunderstanding, rejection and oppression, sometimes from systems that do not even know why they oppose them. And yet the scriptures say that the remnant will stand. They will rise not by power or influence, but by the stirring of the Spirit poured out in the last days, a spirit that teaches them to walk as warriors, even when the world sees only weakness in this chamber. The role of Iran takes on a deeper dimension for Persia is not merely a nation making political threats. It is a vessel caught between forces of judgment and forces of destiny, between the bowl that will break and the promise that it will one day be restored. It stands as a symbol of a kingdom that once aided the covenant and once threatened it, a dual nature that reflects the spiritual confusion beneath its modern ambitions. Many wonder why Iran holds such hostility toward Israel, why its leaders speak with such fervor, and why its alliances form patterns that mirror prophecies written thousands of years ago. But when seen through the lens of the invisible war, the answer becomes clearer. A nation in the grip of an apocalyptic ideology becomes a perfect vessel for forces that oppose the gathering of Israel and the recognition of their Messiah. It moves as a piece on the board, shaped not only by the will of its rulers, but by a deeper hostility rising from ancient darkness. Yet even here the sovereignty of God stands above the turmoil. Persia cannot move outside the boundaries set by the hand that governs nations, and so its threats, its alliances, its ambitions are all part of a larger tapestry leading toward the fulfillment of the written end. The scattering of Elam that Jeremiah foretold may come as a consequence of its aggression. But even its scattering serves a purpose in the unseen war. For when a nation is broken, its people often become open to revelation and mercy in the same breath that judgment is spoken. Restoration is promised, a sign that even in nations aligned with hostility, God still claims the right to redeem. Meanwhile, the scattered tribes awaken, feeling the pull of identity and destiny, sensing that they have a role in the final gathering and that their awakening is not a coincidence, but a sign of the season in the unseen realm. This awakening is like a fire kindling across continents, and the forces of darkness tremble because identity leads to authority. And authority leads to victory. The dragon turns his gaze from one people to another, stirring division between races, nations, and believers. For if unity is achieved among those awakening to their covenant calling, the spiritual balance shifts and the enemy loses ground he has held for centuries. This is why confusion rises whenever the topic of identity is spoken, why accusations fly, why misunderstandings grow like weeds. It is not random, it is war. A war aimed at distracting the awakening remnant from their purpose while nations prepare for battle with weapons. The true battle is fought in hearts that either receive the truth or reject it out of fear or pride. Those who awaken must walk with humility, for arrogance invites deception, and those who observe from a distance must walk with discernment, for dismissing what God is revealing can lead to blindness. The rise of Iran as a force aligned against Israel is only one side of the unfolding. The rise of the scattered tribes discovering their identity is the other, and between these two rises stands the final movement of the story, when nations will choose their side not by ethnicity but by allegiance to the truth. The sixth chamber therefore calls the listener to understanding, to discernment, to vigilance, for the story is no longer ancient alone. It is alive in the world around you. Every headline, every alliance, every shaking among the nations fits into a pattern seen only by those who look through the eyes of prophecy. And so the question presses gently but firmly upon your spirit in this battle that spans heaven and earth, in this awakening that summons scattered tribes and shakes powerful nations. Where do you stand? Are you awake to the spiritual forces shaping the world, or do you still believe the visible world is all there is? The sixth chamber ends not in fear, but in invitation. For those who understand the unseen conflict will be prepared for what comes next, and those who discern the times will know how to walk when the final trumpet draws near. A faint rustle moves across the edges of destiny, like parchment shifting on an unseen altar, and from that quiet movement, a crossroads emerges, a place where scattered tribes and rising empires draw near to one another, as if summoned by the same ancient breath. In this seventh chamber the path bends toward the meeting point of two stories, the awakening of Israel's forgotten branches and the tightening coil of Persia's prophetic roll. For the prophets spoke not of isolated events, but of converging currents, rivers that begin far apart but meet in the valley, where God calls all nations to account. And so the scattered ones, many bearing the memory of Africa, soil, and the echo of ancestral sorrow, rise into the light of recognition. At the same moment that Iran steps into its appointed place in the final drama, the scriptures describe a gathering from the four winds, a reclaiming of those driven into every direction of the earth, and the movement of this gathering does not stop at Jerusalem's gates. It stretches across continents, touches coastlines forgotten by historians, enters cities built on the ruins of old kingdoms, and awakens souls who never imagined they were part of a covenant written before the foundations of the world. Meanwhile, Iran, ancient Elam, moves like a dark figure across the prophetic map. Its ambitions aligned with coalitions foretold by Ezekiel, its pride challenged by warnings etched in Jeremiah, its destiny oscillating between judgment and restoration. As these two threads approach one another, the air grows charged, for when the remnant rises, the adversary responds, and when nations draw their lines, the heavens prepare their own. Ezekiel spoke of two sticks that must be joined in one hand, the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph, a sign that the divided family of Israel will once again stand united, and many who awaken in the diaspora begin to sense that this prophecy is not merely a history lesson, but a living summons that the awakening of lost identity is part of the preparation for this union. And yet the scriptures also speak of nations rising in opposition to this restoration, nations that see the awakening as a threat to their own dominion. Nations whose ideologies sharpen themselves like blades against Jerusalem. Iran stands among them as one of the central actors, a nation whose spiritual posture echoes the hostility of ancient enemies, yet also carries the memory of past mercy for Cyrus, once opened the way for Israel's return, and Esther once stood between destruction and deliverance in the courts of Persia. But in the last days, Iran aligns itself with powers that seek to break Israel rather than rebuild it. And prophecy suggests that this alignment will draw it into a storm far greater than its leaders understand. And here the stories intersect in a way that humbles the human mind. The remnant rises, the nations rage, and the voice of the Lord calls both to their appointed places, the gathering of Israel from distant lands forces the world to confront a truth that has been buried under centuries of misinterpretation. For when the tribes are gathered, the world must reckon with the reality of who they are and who they have always been. And as the tribes awaken, many from Africa and the diaspora feel the pull of a destiny. Long silenced, they begin to search texts, study languages, listen to the testimonies of elders, trace customs preserved in fragments across generations, torn by slavery and displacement. Meanwhile, Iran builds alliances that tighten like a noose, joining forces with nations described in ancient visions, forming patterns so precise they seem carved from the same stone that held the prophetic scrolls. The world sees politics, but Scripture sees alignment, and where these alignments intersect, the remnant must stand ready, for the awakening is not simply about discovering heritage, but about stepping into purpose, and that purpose includes standing in the final conflict of identity versus deception, unity versus division, covenant versus rebellion. In cities across the world, from Lagos to London, from Kingston to Chicago, voices rise in quiet revelation. People begin to sense they are part of the story. Ezekiel saw part of the reason the nations tremble, part of the remnant that must recognize the time. Some feel the divine pull without knowing its name. Some dream of gathering places they have never visited. Some read ancient passages and feel as though a long-lost family member were calling them home. And as they awaken, pressure increases on the global stage. Iran's posture grows bolder, its language more severe, its alliances more pronounced, while the tribes scattered across the earth grow more aware of their identity and their calling. This is not coincidence. It is convergent meeting of prophecies, two rivers flowing into one valley, where the Lord will judge the pride of nations and restore the humbled And so the seventh chamber stands as a warning and a comfort. A warning to nations that oppose the gathering, for no coalition can overturn what God has decreed. A comfort to the scattered, for their awakening is no accident, but the unfolding of a plan written in eternity. The crossroads draws near, and with it the weight of choice nations must choose whether to bless or curse, whether to stand with the covenant or against it, and individuals must choose whether to step into their awakened calling or return to the sleep from which they were stirred. The prophet saw this moment, a moment when the remnant rises and Persia moves, when identity reawakens and hostility intensifies, when the world moves toward a reckoning that has been promised since the first scattering of the tribes. And now that moment stands before you like an open gate. The question is whether you will walk through or turn away, for the crossroads does not wait and the gathering does not pause. The seventh chamber ends with the weight of that truth pressing upon your spirit as gently and firmly as a hand upon your shoulder, calling you forward into what comes next. A dim pulse stirs beneath the surface of the world, like a hidden heartbeat long ignored by the nations, and from that muted throb rises a realization that the battles men see with their eyes are only reflections of something older, deeper, and far more deliberate in this eighth chamber. The veil lifts, not toward nations or tribes, but toward the forces that move behind them, the unseen powers that shape desires, inflame hostilities, and whisper into the ambitions of kings. The scriptures speak of rulers of darkness, of dominions that cloak themselves in ideology and pride, molding empires into instruments of rebellion. And when viewed through that lens, the modern world takes on a clarity both haunting and necessary for the conflict between Iran and Israel, the unrest among the scattered tribes, the rising tension between peoples and races, all trace back to a spiritual architecture that predates history itself. Babylon was the cradle of that architecture. A system not merely political, but spiritual, a weaving of pride, sorcery, oppression, and counterfeit worship. And although its ancient walls have fallen, its spirit continues to move through the corridors of nations like smoke from a fire still burning beneath the earth. Persia absorbed these elements, long ago carrying forward the remnants of Babylon's power, even as it conquered Babylon's throne. And in the present age, those remnants surface again in the rigid ideologies and apocalyptic visions that guide Iran's leaders. Meanwhile, the scattered remnant of Israel, many of them hidden for generations in the margins of society, begin to awaken to their identity. And that awakening is like a spark that agitates the darkness, for the enemy fears the gathering of the tribes more than the armies of any nation. When identity awakens, authority awakens. And when authority awakens, the chains of deception begin to loosen across whole communities and generations. And so the spiritual forces that oppose the covenant move with urgency, stirring divisions, sowing confusion, igniting hatred between peoples who might otherwise walk in unity. The dragon rages because he knows time is short, and his fury is directed not only at Israel as a modern state, but at the entirety of the covenant line, including those emerging from forgotten corners and distant shores. The woman in the wilderness represents the covenant people scattered across lands and cultures, and the remnant of her seed are those who keep the testimony and stand their ground in a world that grows increasingly hostile toward truth. Yet the scriptures promise that even the weakest among them will one day stand with the strength of David. For in the last days, spiritual power does not follow wealth or status, but revelation and obedience. And as this awakening rises, the nations that align themselves against it find their spirits influenced by forces they do not perceive. For the hostility of Iran, the alliances it forms, the burning Desire to wipe out Israel cannot be explained by politics alone. They are the surface expression of a deeper animosity that began when the adversary first rebelled the spirit of Babylon. The shadow that touched Persia, the arrogance that drove ancient empires, moves again in the ideologies of this age, shaping the words of leaders and the desires of nations. Meanwhile, the remnant rises not through political power, but through the quiet work of the Spirit, through dreams and vision, through scriptures illuminated in midnight prayers, through a sense of calling that no empire can extinguish. This is why the awakening of the tribes is met with immediate resistance. Why the topic of identity is twisted into division. Why communities fracture the moment they begin to remember who they are. The enemy understands the stakes. He knows that the gathering precedes the restoration, that restoration precedes the return of the king, and that the return of the king signals the end of his influence upon the earth. And so he wages war not by swords alone, but by whispering bitterness into the heart, fear into the mind, suspicion between people, pride into those who awaken, and contempt into those who do not. In this eighth chamber, the truth becomes sharper than any earthly conflict. The real war is not Israel versus Iran, nor tribe versus just tribe, nor race versus race. The real war is light against shadow, covenant against rebellion, truth against deception, and every soul alive walks across this battlefield. Even if they do not see it in cities across the world, there are hidden warriors who fight without armor or banner. Mothers who pray in kitchens at dawn, fathers who whisper scripture in the dark, young men and women who return to the old texts with trembling elders who speak truths they carried silently for decades. These are the ones who stand between the world and the collapse into darkness, the ones whose prayers push back the tide of violence, the ones whose awakening becomes a shield for their communities. They stand unnoticed by governments, but seen by heaven. And the battle moves around them like wind across desert stone, and opposition stand systems shaped by spiritual forces that do not sleep, systems that feed on chaos, systems that reward pride and punish humility, systems that mask rebellion in the language of justice and deceit in the language of truth. These systems move through nations and institutions, through regimes and alliances, and often through those who believe themselves righteous. And so the eighth chamber is both revelation and rebuke. It reveals the true architecture of the conflict and rebukes any belief that the battle can be won by human effort alone. For no coalition of nations can stop what God has ordained, and no ideology of darkness can overturn the restoration of Israel's scattered sons and daughters. The spiritual forces that oppose the awakening will strike harder as the gathering draws nearer. They will stir greater division, provoke greater violence, unleash greater deception, but the scriptures promise that the remnant will overcome by the testimony they carry and the courage they display in the face of rising night. And so this eighth chamber draws to a close with the most sobering truth of all: the world is not drifting, it is being pulled. Nations are not wandering, they are being arranged. Hearts are not confused, they are being tested, and every person alive in these days stands in the balance between two kingdoms, one fading, one rising. The question that rests upon you now is simple but eternal in this unseen war that shapes every visible moment. Which kingdom does your life strengthen, and which does it resist? The eighth chamber awaits your answer as the path turns toward the final ascent. A quiet shimmer rises over the edge of the age, subtle as dawn on the surface of still water, and in that trembling light, the final patterns of prophecy begin to take form, revealing threads once hidden beneath centuries of dust in this ninth chamber. The world stands at a threshold where choices deepen into destinies, and every life, every nation, every remnant soul moves closer to the place where all paths converge beneath the gaze of the Eternal One. The awakening of scattered Israel continues like a pulse traveling through continents, stirring hearts in distant lands, calling forgotten tribes into remembrance, and pressing upon them the weight of purpose that comes with identity restored at the same time. Iran moves through prophecy with the stubborn resolve of a nation convinced of its own mission, a nation driven by visions older than its borders, echoing with the voices of ancient empires and the shadows that shaped them. As these two currents draw nearer, tension grows like a bowstring stretched toward breaking, not from chaos alone, but from design, for the scriptures do not describe a world slipping into disorder, but a world aligning itself around the purposes of God. Even when nations resist him, Ezekiel saw this alignment. Isaiah heard its rhythm, Jeremiah felt its weight, and John recorded its final tremors in the visions of Patmos. And now the world begins to mirror those visions so closely that the difference between prophecy and headline grows thinner by the day. The remnant awakening across Africa, the Americas, and distant islands senses that the world is shifting beneath their feet, that the identity they rediscover is not for pride, but for readiness for the role they must play as the tribes gather from the ends of the earth. Meanwhile, Iran's posture grows sharper, its rhetoric darker, its alliances more deliberate. And the world watches, as if witnessing a great shadow rise behind the mountains of ancient Elam. Yet the scriptures teach that judgment and mercy walk side by side, even in the fate of nations, that the bow of Elam must break before the restoration can begin, and that the breaking will shake more than Iran alone, for the tremor of one nation's downfall often ripples across the world. Nations rise and fall for reasons deeper than politics, driven by currents they do not perceive, guided by hands they do not acknowledge. And in this chamber the listener is forced to reckon with the sobering truth: the world is being positioned for a moment when the veil between natural and supernatural will thin, when the clarity of the times will be undeniable, and when neutrality will no longer be possible. This ninth chamber reveals that the awakening of identity and the rise of hostility are not parallel events, but intersecting ones, destined to collide when the Lord calls all tribes before him. For the gathering of Israel is not only about return, it is about recognition. The moment when the covenant people, restored from every direction of the earth, perceive the one whom the prophets foretold, and the world will not remain still. As this recognition unfolds, nations will react, alliances will form, hostility will intensify, and spiritual forces will manifest more openly through the actions of rulers and the upheavals of societies. The remnant will feel this pressure first, especially those rising from the diaspora, for the enemy always strikes hardest at the ones awakening to their calling. The scriptures describe a season when deception increases, when truth becomes costly, when unity becomes a battleground, and when identity becomes a sword that divides light from shadow. And in this moment, the remnant must choose whether to walk in humility or pride, in discernment or confusion, in courage or fear. For the awakening is not merely a revelation, but a refining. Those who answer the call will be shaped into witnesses capable of standing in the darkest hour, while those who treat the awakening as a weapon or badge will soon lose their footing. Meanwhile, Iran, pushed by spiritual currents it does not understand, will step further into its prophetic role, aligning itself with nations driven by the same ancient darkness that once stirred Babylon and later empowered Rome. Yet even as it moves toward confrontation, the hand of God remains over its destiny, breaking what must be broken, scattering what must be scattered, preparing even its people for a restoration they cannot yet imagine. The world around them will shake as nations choose their sides, not by ethnicity or heritage, but by allegiance to truth or allegiance to deception. In this ninth chamber, a profound clarity emerges. The battle of the last days is not simply geopolitical, not simply racial, not simply cultural. It is a battle for perception, a battle for the truth, a battle for the loyalty of the human soul. And every person alive in these days participates, whether they wish to or not. The remnant must learn to walk with eyes open, for deception will come in forms that imitate righteousness, and hostility will come disguised as justice. And the nations must learn that opposing the covenant brings consequences, for the God who gathers his people also defends them, and individuals must learn that the awakening is not a mere curiosity, but summons a call to walk in the destiny written for their generation as the ninth chamber nears its end. The vision grows sharper, the tribes rising, the nations aligning, the spiritual forces converging, the world trembling as the final act draws near. And the question that rests upon your spirit becomes unavoidable when the gathering reaches its fullness and the nations take their stand, when identity blooms and deception rises, when Iran makes its move and Israel prepares for what the prophet saw. Where will your steps lead you? For the path ahead is no longer theoretical. It is already unfolding, and your place within it will echo long after this age is passed into the light of the coming King. A solemn breath moves across the edge of eternity, faint yet unmistakable, like the first stir of wind before a long-awaited storm, and in that breath the final contours of the age emerge with a clarity that silences every lesser sound. In this 10th and final chamber, the world stands beneath a sky heavy with prophecy, the kind of sky under which kings tremble, nations falter, and all humanity feels the pull of an unseen hand drawing history toward its appointed end. Here, the scattered tribes reach the threshold of their gathering, awakened not merely to their heritage, but to the purpose for which they were preserved through centuries of exile, injustice, and silence. Meanwhile, Iran nears the fulfillment of a role, older than its modern identity, stepping into the shadow and light assigned by prophets who lived and died long before its current rulers took their thrones. The convergence of these two currents marks the moment when the world can no longer pretend that history is random, or that the old words of Scripture were mere poetry, for the last movements of prophecy do not whisper, they resound like footsteps echoing down a stone corridor, drawing near with every passing hour, and the earth itself seems to sense it trembling beneath conflicts that tighten toward a point of no return, rising in unrest, shifting in alliances, unveiling the spirits that animate its kingdoms. The awakening among the scattered remnant intensifies like embers bursting into flame, as winds of revelation pass through lands that once bore chains, plantations, and forgotten sorrows. The children of the diaspora begin to see the thread of covenant woven through their resilience, their survival, their yearning for a home they have never seen yet somehow remember. They rise with a hunger for truth deeper than tradition, searching manuscripts, questioning narratives, tracing echoes in language, music, and memory. And as they rise, the adversary stirs with renewed fury, for he knows the gathering of tribes signals the nearing return of the one he fears most, and so deception multiplies false teachings, spread pride disguises itself as revelation, and division creeps among communities, awakening to their identity. Yet the true remnant, those refined by humility and discernment, stand like pillars in places the world would never expect. Meanwhile, Iran moves into the crescendo of its prophetic arc, its leaders speaking as though scripted by ancient warnings, its alliances forming the very patterns Ezekiel described, its ambitions kindling the spark that could ignite the final conflict, and yet at the center of its destiny stands a paradox: judgment followed by restoration, scattering followed by mercy, breaking followed by healing, for even the nations that rage fulfill the designs of the one who shaped them. And even the darkest ideologies cannot move a single step beyond the boundaries he has set. As these forces rise and collide, the world enters the narrow passage between ages, a passage filled with tribulation, yet illuminated by purpose, where the faithful learn to walk by revelation rather than sight, and where the remnant discovers the strength placed within them long before their birth. The final chamber reveals an unsettling truth. The greatest battle of the last days is not fought on the plains of nations, but in the human soul, the battle to believe truth in a world of deception, to walk in humility in a world of pride, to love in a world trained to hate, to stand firm in a world that shakes, and the awakening of the scattered tribes becomes a mirror placed before humanity, reflecting both the justice and mercy of God, his justice in preserving a people no empire could erase, His mercy in gathering them with tenderness despite their long exile. And as this restoration unfolds, the role of Iran becomes a testament to his sovereignty, a nation raised, broken, scattered, and one day restored according to his decree alone. For the end of the age is not chaos but choreography, then precise fulfillment of promises made to patriarchs, prophets, and generations yet unborn. And as the prophecies align, the earth feels the weight of a question that can no longer be delayed. A question that does not come from angels or kings, but from the one whose presence fills the chambers of eternity. When the gathering reaches its fullness and the nations take their stand, when the remnant awakens and the kingdoms rage, when the scroll of history nears its final line, where will you stand? For the end is not merely an event, but a revelation. It reveals who belongs to the truth and who clings to deception, who walks by the Spirit and who follows the shadows, who prepares for the return of the King and who denies his coming. The final chamber brings you face to face with that choice, not as an observer of prophecy, but as a participant whose life will echo beyond this age. The question becomes unavoidable, not meant to frighten, but to awaken. Are you ready to walk in the identity, the calling, the courage written for you before the foundations of the world? Are you prepared to stand when the world trembles and to shine when the nations darken? For the return of the King draws near, and the gathering of the tribes is his sign to the world that the last dawn approaches. The path of history bends toward his throne, and every soul must choose whether to walk toward that light or turn away from it. Here at the close of the 10th chamber, the breath of eternity falls silent again, waiting for your answer, waiting for your allegiance, waiting for the steps you will take when the final call goes forth and the world awakens to the arrival of the one who reigns forever.